Vintage Finds started as a written segment on 21st and 18th where I would unravel the history and details and life behind all different types of vintage products. So that could be a dress, a hat, a pair of gloves, a teacup, a work of art. We've gone in so many different directions, and it's always really fun and surprising. You learn so much about different things you pick up for sometimes $1 or $2. Um, and what we thought would be really fun, because Vintage Finds is proving to be one of the most popular segments on 21st and 18th, is to bring you Vintage Finds IRL from my parlor with Vintage Finds TV. Let's get going. Up first, we have pieces of silver from Vienna, Austria by silversmith JCK or Josef Karl Klinkosch. Before we tuck into these incredible silver pieces and the history behind JCK, yes, I'm sitting on my floor in my parlor with Jasper, my cat, who's snuggled up by the fire. It's a rainy day here in San Diego, which doesn't happen often, but is happening more frequently. And I thought I'd take advantage of being a captive audience in my home with the gray days, which are usually good for filming. So here we are. Shall we? So JCK Silver, pretty incredible. If you Google the name JCK or just the initials or JCK Silver, you will see loads of results, over 16,000 to be exact. And the fascinating thing about this silver set is that my husband, Wemple, that's his last name, that's what I call him, Wemple inherited this silver from his late grandmother, and she was Austrian. Her parents were Austrian, and we know that her mother, so Wemple's great grandmother, had actually had her family's crest and her personal initials inlaid or stamped into every piece in this silver collection. So cool. It's incredible. Her crest is kind of where I started to start understanding the history behind these pieces of silver. I know they're super well made and valuable, because why would you keep something for centuries over generations, moving around countries and continents, if it weren't valuable? Obviously, things have sentimental value, but when you're dealing with hundreds of pieces of silver in a collection, it's a little bit annoying and cumbersome to travel around with. So I knew these pieces were valuable. I started by looking for stamps on the silver, which many of you who are vintage find or thrifter enthusiasts, you might know to start doing that as well. It's the same with porcelain, but a lot of decorative or metalwares. There's usually a stamp noting what the material is or the purity of the metal if you're dealing with silver or gold, for example, and then a stamp by the maker. So something kind of like a serial code, or like something that if you bought a Chanel bag or an Hermes bag today, there would be some sort of identifier so that you would know, and whoever owned that bag after you would know that it is authentic. Same goes here. And so this silver maker, JCK, he was born in 1822, and he lived until the end of the 1800s, at which point his sons took over his operation. His father, Josef Karl Klinkosch's father, was a silversmith as well. So he ended up apprenticing for his father when he's about age 15, maybe even a little bit younger. And he officially took over the business, I believe, when he was about between 18 and 20 years old. So he takes over the business, and then their silversmith operation, which was already doing very well, kind of exploded. So JCK was then, in 1937, named court silversmith by the emperor at the time, Franz Josef. And if my historians out there will know that he is the husband of Elizabeth, or Cece, who is very popular in pop culture and was back then. So JCK is named court silversmith, and that effectively means that if you were a person in the court, so if you had a title, if you were a part of the imperial family, if you lived and operated around Viennese royal society or imperial society, you would have used JCK to have your silver made. Yes, this is very interesting. So we go back to the crest, right? So the reason why the crest is on these pieces of silver, um, and with the heraldic crown atop, is because Wempel's Viennese ancestors were aristocratic. So cool. As Americans, we always get such a joy and like a heart palpitation out of anyone having any sort of royal title because we don't have that here. We have celebrities and wealthy people and dynastic political families, but we don't have inherited titles and things like that. So it's fascinating to us. The woman who had this set of silver inlaid with her family crest was Wempel's great grandmother, as previously mentioned, and her name was Marie Gebauer Edel von Fulmig. Yeah. Usually if you have like a couple of last names or more, you got something going on in the family history. Might sound familiar. The best example, if you're thinking about Austria, is the Von Trapp family and the Sound of Music. So that Von is sort of the level below where Marie would have been in sort of the class of different titles. It starts at the emperor and it goes down from there, right? And then the next step up is what they would call edle, or for a woman, edel. And so that's why she has an edel and a von in her name. Really interesting. Super interesting. And so, what's even more interesting about these pieces, so this fork, number one, it's really heavy. Number two, the tines, these bits right here, they could stab someone. I know that sounds morbid, but they're so incredibly sharp. And I have to wonder what it was really like the original user when these were fresh out of the JCK factory. That must have been an interesting experience dining. So efficient and effective, really easy to stab the meat, whatever you're dining on. It's also quite large. So I have this large glass here, but just so you can see, I'll stand it up. Like, it is a very tall fork. That's my head. Um, Forks are, of course, long. Dinner forks are the longest, but these are just slightly longer than what you would find today. Another interesting thing to note, if we're thinking specifically about the crest and the use of the crest on every single piece, the inclusion of the crest on every single piece, this is not just an identifier to let people know who are using it or kind of tell the world that yes, this is who we are. We are noble. We have the ability and the means to have this type of silver, and this is who it belongs to. This is our title and station. But it's also a great way to keep track of all of the pieces of silver. So again, we were talking about how cumbersome it was to have these silver collections and bring them with you for generations, for years. Typically, they would stay in one place in theory if you had an estate, but interestingly, this silver did travel a lot. Before we talk about that, the crest would have been a way to keep all of the pieces together. So, because JCK was really popular, I'm sure they made other forks that look just like this. But the Gebauer Fulnig family knew that these were theirs based on the crest. It's also a good way if a piece gets lost or stolen, you know who it belongs to. So I mentioned briefly that this silver has moved around a bit and it would be cumbersome to move all these different pieces. The reason this silver moved, and this is really crazy and fascinating, the story takes so many turns, is because this silverware owned by the Gebauer Fulnig family, Wempel's relatives, they were Jewish and they fled Austria during World War II when Hitler was in power because of anti Semitism, because of how atrocious the Nazis treated Jews as well as other minority groups and people who were sympathetic to Jews. They fled from Austria and emigrated to the United States by way of Shanghai, China. Crazy. And so this silver came from Austria to China and then all the way to California. So it would have been in Northern California, which is where Wempel's ancestors settled. And then now in 2024, we've got pieces of it down here in San Diego, so Southern California. Um, so crazy. Really incredible. Makes me super proud of the pieces. I already knew they were valuable. Number one, JCK is really valuable. Number two, entire sets of silver are extremely valuable. You don't see this usually. the fact that this silver has come so far and was a point of pride for the family to maintain and travel with them during this crazy, devastating, scary time, it has even more history and more meaning. So I'm really proud to have it. I'm super excited to share this story with generations to come and guests who come and dine with us here. Um, it's just incredible. I feel really grateful. And it's a vintage find story that obviously means so much more than, oh, I got this incredible Alexander McQueen coat for a pittance based on what it's worth. That's a fun thing. I'll end there. If we're going to talk about worth, JCK silver, if you go and you look on auction sites or places like Bonhams or Sotheby's or even First Dibs has a lot of, not a lot, but a number of pieces. JCK pieces, depending on the timing, where they're from, most of them, they fetch a pretty penny. So I found candelabras, for example, at about $20,000 at auction, full sets of silver for it. It's crazy. Have a look yourself. I will link to some interesting articles that you can go down a rabbit hole in. The last thing I'll say, if you're interested in learning more about Marie Gebauer-Vollnig's story and Wempel's ancestors, and this incredible Josef Karl Klinkosch silver, then visit us at 21st and 18th.com. On the newsletter, we did a vintage finds article, deep dive into the history of JCK, into the history of the family. I even linked to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where you will see Marie's name as a Holocaust survivor. It's really interesting. I encourage you to come and join the chatter about that. The last vintage find we're going to be talking about today is this beautiful frame print it's a frame print of the Lute Player, which is a painting from Orazio Gentileschi. The name Gentileschi might sound familiar. There were other artists, and they specifically Artemisia Gentileschi, that you might have heard if you like art or you study art history, you go to lots of museums, but they are not related. Gentileschi was actually his, I believe, maternal uncle's surname, and he took it when he moved to Rome and began his career as an artist. This is a really interesting work of art by Gentileschi. He was highly influenced by Caravaggio and his style of painting, which was, a seismic shift in painting in the 1600s in Italy and then across Europe. And he's a really interesting artist in himself, that he moved to Rome and he became very involved as an artist, and he started to get loads of work as a painter, but on teams for big projects. So he was a part of paintings at the Vatican, for example, but he was not the lead painter. He was one of the painters working on the team to make the work of that head painter, that head artist, come to life. So this work of art is actually credited to him between the dates of 1612 and 1620, which is a pretty long period. Art historians don't necessarily know when he was exposed to Caravaggio's work, because it really influenced how he painted. So maybe during this time, we can't necessarily date it specifically, or maybe it took a really long time. It's interesting to sort of suppose about artists at this time. So I knew this work. I actually acquired it when I was living in Washington, D.C. I was working in tech alongside cultural attractions. We can go down that tangent later. But I used to go to the National Gallery of Art all the time. It's an incredible museum. It's free. And this piece is in the West Building. So it's actually hanging there on view. And I would always be antiquing on the weekends when I wasn't working in DC. And I loved looking at antiques from estate sales and these little shops. You get incredible stuff that comes from Virginia and Maryland. And I saw this work of art when I was actually in an auto body shop. Well, I guess I was above an auto body shop. And there was this interesting Frenchman who used to bring in antiques from Virginia, and you could, make deals for lots and find incredible stuff. And so I found this piece there. And what I really liked about this piece was, of course, it was of the Lute Player by Gentileschi, which was a piece I knew, and it was at the NGA, which is close to my heart. But I love that it was framed. It was pre-hung, so I could easily just bring it home and put a nail in the wall and put it up in my apartment. But then I also thought it was fascinating. So it has this little tag here that reads New York Graphic Society, Greenwich, Connecticut. And then it has what I would assume at the time probably corresponded to how they organized their works of art at the National Gallery of Art. It says 7395 Gentileschi, the Lute Player, custom framed especially for National Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C. Why this is really interesting. Obviously, the work of art hangs at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., but this is fascinating to me because they had this print made and framed. Maybe they were selling the prints. Perhaps they were giving them to, I don't know, people in their community. I'm not necessarily sure why at the time they would have gone through the trouble of having this really beautifully made and framed print done. All I know is that I'm so glad that I profited from it. It's extremely beautiful. It has a lot of chips. You can see that it's made a lot of moves. It's actually moved to 4 different places with me, but it's made a lot of moves before I owned it. And there are some marks in the print, but I kind of love that. I think that it adds to the history of it, and it just adds to the story. Just had a brain blast. Thinking about the date of which that print was likely made by the National Gallery of Art, it's very likely that maybe that was their system for loans or keeping, like they didn't have computers at the time. My guess is it was the 60s because of the font, the text, everything in that little sticker. My guess is it's the 60s. I'll have to ask someone at the National Gallery. I'm sure I can get an answer. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching VintageFinds TV from 21st and 18th. I'm Lauren Lynch-Wemple. Happy to be here with you today. It was super fun. If you like art, history, and fashion, visit us online at 21stand18th.com. You'll see our weekly newsletter where we time travel through a variety of decades, interview experts and people like museum curators from around the world, and then shop our online vintage catalog. We've got fashion, accessories, and antiques. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at 21st and 18th. And if you want to follow me, I'm at _low_Lynch. Be warned, I mostly post about horses and fashion and the cat Jasper. Cheers.